In the autumn of 2011, a woman with advanced dementia, 91 years old, in a hospital 5 hours from where my mother was buried, on a floor I had never spoken her name on, looked up at me from her pillow and called me by my mother's maiden name, a name she could not have known, a name nobody at that hospital knew, a name that by the year 2011 was probably written down in 3 places on this earth, and not one of them anywhere near St. Vincent's Memorial. Her name was Edith Larkin. She had advanced Alzheimer's. She did not know what year it was. She did not know her own children when they came to visit. She had stopped speaking a full sentence about 6 months before she came to us. She was at St. Vincent's because she had broken her hip in a fall, and the hip was healing, but she was not. They were waiting for her to be stable enough to send back to the memory care facility she came from. She was on the 3rd floor, West Wing. Not the dying wing, just the regular medical floor. I was not supposed to be having a conversation with her. I was supposed to be emptying her bin and moving on. But she sat up, and she looked at me, and she said a name I had not heard out loud in 40 years. And then she said 3 more things before her daughter walked in. 3 things I have never been able to explain. My name is Arthur. I worked the night shift as a janitor at St. Vincent's Memorial Hospital from 1986 until I retired last spring. 38 years. I want to tell you about my mother first, because to understand what happened with Edith Larkin, you have to understand what my mother was, and what she was not, and what almost nobody knew about her. My mother's name when she died was Margaret Thompson. That was my father's last name. She had taken it in 1948 when she married him, and she kept it for the rest of her life. She died in 1971, when I was 21 years old, of a heart attack at the age of 47. She was sitting in her kitchen, peeling potatoes for Sunday dinner, and her heart stopped. And that was that. But Margaret Thompson was not the name she was born with. The name she was born with in a small town in northern Minnesota in 1924 was Margaret Solberg. Solberg, a Norwegian name. Her father had come over from Norway as a boy and never quite lost the accent. Her mother had died when she was 9. She had grown up in a small house at the edge of a wheat field, and she had left that town when she was 18, and she had never been back. She did not talk about Solberg. She did not talk about Minnesota. She did not talk about her father or her mother or the wheat field. When I was small and I asked her, she would say, "That was a long time ago, and that was a different girl." She had drawn a line through her past with a heavy hand, and she did not want anybody to step across it. Not me, not my father, not anybody. I do not know everything that happened to her up there. I have always suspected something. I have my reasons, but that is a different story, and it is not mine to tell. What I want you to understand is this. The name Margaret Solberg by 2011 was almost gone from this world. Her father had died in 1962. Her mother had died in 1933. She had no siblings. She had no cousins that she ever mentioned. Her marriage license had her maiden name on it, and that license was in a file box in my younger brother's basement in Phoenix. Her birth certificate was in the same box. There was no living person anywhere that I knew of who had ever called her Solberg. Her gravestone, in the cemetery where my father is also buried, said Margaret Thompson, beloved wife and mother, 1924 to 1971. There was no Solberg on it. I had not said the name Solberg out loud in 40 years, not once. Not to my wife, who knew it but did not use it. Not to my sons, who I am not entirely sure even knew it. It was a closed door in my life that I had agreed, a long time ago, not to open. I want to say one more thing about my mother before I move on, because it matters. My mother was a quiet woman. She did not laugh much. She did not cry much. She kept a clean house, and she made good biscuits, and she went to church on Sundays, and she sat in the back pew. She loved me, in her quiet way. I never doubted that. But there was always something in her that was somewhere else. Some part of her that had stayed up there in Minnesota, in that house at the edge of the wheat field, when the rest of her had come south. When she died, when I was 21, I sat at her funeral and I thought about the parts of her I had never known. I thought about the Margaret Solberg who had walked away from a town and never looked back. I thought about whatever had made her walk. I thought about whether, in her last moment in that kitchen, peeling potatoes, she had been thinking about my father and me and my brother, or whether she had been thinking about that other place, the place she never spoke of. I never knew. I never asked the questions when she was alive that I should have asked, and when she was gone, there was nobody left to ask. So Solberg, by 2011, was a closed door, a name I had not said, a name nobody around me used, a name that lived in my chest like a small bird in a covered cage, alive but quiet. Until October 14, 2011, a Friday night, around 3 in the morning. Edith Larkin had been on the 3rd floor for about a week when I started to notice her. She was the kind of patient that night nurses talked about at the station. She did not sleep. She was awake at all hours, sitting up in her bed, looking out the window or at the door or at her hands. She did not call out. She did not cause trouble. She just sat there awake, hour after hour, watching. Her daughter came in every evening at 6 and stayed until 10. The daughter was a kind, exhausted woman in her 60s. I would see her sometimes when I came on shift. We would nod at each other in the corridor. She would say, "Evening, Arthur," and I would say, "Evening, Mrs. Larkin." Her name was Linda Larkin. She had taken back her own married name when her mother needed her, and her own life had bent to her mother's care for years. The night nurses told me Edith mostly did not speak. When she did speak, she said 1 or 2 words. She said water, sometimes. She said no, sometimes. She said her dead husband's name, sometimes. His name was Bernard. And she would say Bernard once or twice and then go quiet again. She did not have conversations. She did not respond to questions. The doctors had not heard her say a full sentence in months. I went into her room the first time on a Tuesday. She was sitting up in bed, looking at the window. The blinds were closed. There was nothing to see, but she was looking. I emptied her bin. I said, "Evening, ma'am." She did not look at me. She did not respond. I left. This was the pattern for about a week. I would go in around 3 in the morning. She would be awake. She would not respond. I would do my work and leave. On the Friday night, October 14th, I came in around 2:50. The room was quiet. Edith was sitting up in bed as usual. The bedside lamp was on low. She was looking, this time, not at the window, but at the chair beside her bed. The chair where her daughter sat in the evenings. The chair was empty. I started to empty the bin. She said in a voice that was clear and unhurried, and not at all the voice of a confused old woman, she said, "Solberg, are you still here?" I froze. I had my hand inside the bin liner. I did not move. She said it again. She said, "Solberg." I straightened up slowly. I turned and I looked at her. She was looking at the chair, not at me, at the empty chair. I said, "Ma'am?" She turned her head, slowly, and she looked at me. And she had that look in her eyes that dementia patients sometimes get, where they are looking at you but they are also looking through you, like you are slightly transparent and there is something behind you that they can almost see. She said, "Oh, there you are. I was looking for you." I did not know what to say. I said, "Ma'am, I think you might be confused. I am Arthur. I am the janitor." She said, "No, you are Solberg. You are Margaret's boy." I cannot describe what happened in my chest when she said that. I want to be honest with you. I am not a man who scares easy. I have been told 100 strange things by 100 dying patients. But this was not a dying patient. This was a confused old woman with a broken hip, and she had just used the maiden name of my mother, who had been dead for 40 years, and she had identified me as Margaret's boy. I just stared at her. I could not speak. She said, "I have been waiting for you. They said you would come. They said it would be late at night and you would be wearing dark clothes. They said you would be the one with the kind eyes." I said, "Ma'am, I think you have me confused with somebody else." She smiled. It was the saddest smile I have ever seen on a person's face. She said, "No, dear, I am confused about a lot of things. I am confused about the year and the place and my own name half the time. But I am not confused about this. You are Margaret Solberg's boy. Your mother sent you a message. I want to tell you something. In 38 years on the night shift, I have learned to distinguish between three kinds of things. There is the morphine talking. There is the dementia talking. And then, very rarely, there is something else talking. Something I do not have a name for. Something that uses the morphine, or uses the dementia, but is not the morphine, and is not the dementia. Something that comes through the cracks when the door is open enough. I am not telling you this is what was happening. I am telling you that in that moment, in that room, on that Friday night in October, I had the unmistakable feeling that I was standing in front of the third kind of thing. I said, "Ma'am, what message?" Edith looked at me steadily. The fog had cleared from her eyes. I am not making that up. The fog had cleared. She was looking at me the way a person who has known me my whole life would look at me, and she said three things to me. I am going to tell you all three. The first thing she said was, "Your mother says she did not have a heart attack." I just stood there. My mouth went dry. My mother had died of a heart attack. That was the cause of death on her certificate. That was what the doctor had said. That was what we had all been told. That was the story for 40 years. The second thing she said was, "Your mother says she was at peace, but that the man knew. The man knew, Arthur, and he never said." I said, "Ma'am, what man?" Edith said, "She does not say his name. She just says, 'The man knew.'" The third thing she said, and this is the one that I have thought about the most, the third thing she said was, "Your mother says you are going to be all right. She says the long shift is almost over. She says she has been watching you sweep the floors for 40 years, and she is proud of you, and she wants you to know it was not your fault. None of it was your fault." And then Edith Larkin closed her eyes, and she sat back against her pillows, and she said in a much smaller voice, "Oh dear, I think I need to sleep now." The fog came back into her face. I could see it come back, like a curtain being drawn. I stood there in the middle of the room. I could not move. My hands were shaking. I was 61 years old at the time, and I was shaking like a child. The door opened. Linda Larkin came in. She had decided to come back at night, she told me later, because she had a feeling about her mother. She had been a nurse herself, decades before. She had learned to trust the feelings. She saw my face. She said, "Arthur, are you all right?" I said, "Yes, ma'am. I am sorry. I will get out of your way." She said, "Did she say something to you?" I looked at her. I did not know what to say. I said, "Your mother said something to me, ma'am. She said some things I did not expect." Linda looked at her mother, who was now asleep, or pretending to be asleep, or had simply gone wherever she went when she went away from us. Linda said, "My mother has been talking to people who are not there for the last 6 months. The doctor says it is part of the disease. She talks to her own mother. She talks to her sister who died as a baby. She talks to a neighbor she had in 1955. She said, 'Sometimes, Arthur, I think she sees things the rest of us do not.'" I did not say anything. I just nodded. I went back out into the corridor. I finished my floor. I drove home at the end of my shift, and I did not tell my wife what had happened. Not that morning, not that week, not that year. Edith Larkin died 11 days later. Not at our hospital. She had been stable enough to transfer back to her memory care facility, and she had passed quietly there, in her sleep, on a Tuesday afternoon. Linda came back to St. Vincent's about 3 weeks later to thank the staff. She found me in the corridor on the 3rd floor. She gave me a small box of cookies and a card. I still have the card. She said, "Arthur, I want to tell you something. The night before my mother passed, she was lucid for about half an hour. The first time in over a year. She asked me to thank you. She said to tell Margaret's boy that the message went through. Those were her exact words. The message went through. Do you know what that means?" I said, "Yes, ma'am, I know what that means." She said, "Will you tell me?" I said, "No, ma'am, I cannot tell you, I am sorry. It is a private thing. But I will tell you that your mother did me a great kindness, and I will be grateful to her for the rest of my life." Linda nodded. She did not press me. She gave me a hug, and she walked away. That was 2011, 13 years ago. Now I want to tell you what I have done with the things Edith Larkin told me, because for 13 years I have been turning them over in my head, and I have come to some conclusions. Not certainty, just conclusions. The first thing she told me was that my mother had not had a heart attack. I have thought about this for 13 years. I have not asked anybody. I have not opened the file box in my brother's basement. I have not contacted a doctor or a coroner or anybody who might know. I have left it where it is, because I have come to believe, slowly over years, that whether or not it was a heart attack, my mother is still gone, and the manner of her going does not change what she meant to me. And because I think in some quiet place in myself that I have always suspected. I have always suspected something, and I have always not wanted to know. The second thing she told me was that the man knew. The man knew, Arthur, and he never said. I have a theory about who the man was. I am not going to share it. It is not my story to tell. The man, whoever he was, has been dead for many years. There is no justice to be had. There is only the knowing, and the knowing is mine to carry. What I will say is this. When I was a small boy before my mother died, there was a man who used to come to our house every now and then. He was a friend of my father's, was the way he was introduced. He drank coffee in the kitchen with my father on Sunday afternoons. He was not a relative. He did not bring his own family. My mother would always find a reason to be in another room when he came. She did not greet him. She did not sit with the men at the kitchen table. She would be in the garden or upstairs folding laundry, or out on the porch shelling peas. I never thought anything of it as a boy. Some grown-ups just did not get along was the way I figured it. After my mother died, that man stopped coming around. I had not thought about him in 50 years until Edith Larkin said the words, "The man knew." And the moment she said it, I saw his face, clear as if he had walked into the hospital room. I have not stopped seeing it since. I am not telling you that he had something to do with how my mother died. I do not know that. I have no proof of anything. I am telling you that I have a feeling, and the feeling has lived in my chest for 50 years, and Edith Larkin reached in and put her finger on it. The third thing she told me is the one I have lived by. The third thing she told me is that my mother had been watching me sweep the floors for 40 years, and she was proud of me, and she wanted me to know it was not my fault. None of it. I have carried that for 13 years. I have carried it through the rest of my career, and through my retirement, and into this chair where I am sitting tonight. I have carried it the way a man carries a candle through a long, dark hallway. I have not always believed it. There have been nights when I have set it down and walked away from it, but it has always still been there in the morning, still lit, waiting. I do not know how Edith Larkin knew my mother's maiden name. I do not know how a confused old woman in a hospital bed in 2011 used a name that had not been spoken out loud in 40 years, and that nobody at that hospital had any way of knowing. I have a theory. I think there are people sometimes who get thin, who get worn down by age and by sickness, and by the slow loosening of the self. And I think that when they get thin enough, sometimes other things can move through them. Not always, not even often, but sometimes. And I think Edith Larkin was thin that night. I think she was so thin she was almost transparent. And I think my mother, who had been waiting for 40 years, found a moment when the door was open enough, and she sent her boy a message. I do not know if you believe that. I am 74 years old, and I am barely sure I believe it myself on most days. But I know what was said in that room. I know what name she used. And I know that I went home that morning, and I sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time, and for the first time in 40 years, I cried for my mother. Not because she was gone. I had cried about that before. But because she had not been gone. Not really. She had been there the whole time, watching me sweep. I am Arthur, 38 years on the night shift, and this is the third story I have not told until tonight. I am starting to wonder if I have been collecting them on purpose.